Hello everyone, welcome to the session. In this session, we are going to discuss about character encoding in Java. So this would be the agenda of the session. What is character encoding in general? All character encoding schemes supported by Java. Default character encoding in Java and which all API or operations uses this default encoding. So this would be a demo. Encoding at different stages like when you are saving the source file, when you are compiling a file or at runtime when you are running your code. So this would also be a demo how to change Java default encoding scheme. So this would also be a demo. So let's begin our session. Now let's see quickly what is character encoding in general. Let's move on to the dashboard. When we talk about character encoding, means we are talking about encoding plus decoding. In character encoding, what happens? The characters are converted into bits. We call it binary. This is encoding. And in decoding, these bits or binary convert into character. This is called decoding. When you save your file, any text file that is first converted into bits, then it is saved in memory. That is first converted into bits, then it is saved in memory. When you are reading that file, those bits from memory or data present in memory converted into text through the decoding process. And we have a different character encoding schemes or standard to perform these two operations, encoding and decoding, like UTF-8. UTF-8 is one of the UTF-8 is widely used encoding standard. UTF-32, 16, ASCII, ANSI. So these are the character encoding standards available, and UTF-8 is widely used. I already created one video on character encoding in detail. Please check that video. I would put the link in the description of the video. Now let's see why the character encoding is important. We will try to understand with the help of one Java example. If the character encoding or decoding is not done properly, there would be chances that we will not able to read the particular character. We might see the question mark or any other strange character instead of actual character. So this happens because of the character encoding, because of the some issue with the character encoding or decoding. You can see two screenshots I have attached. First one is the actual character, first one is the actual text, and second one is the one which particular text editor has shown. So you can see the question mark because that text editor was not able to read these characters because of the character encoding was not set properly in the text editor. So these kind of issues we encounter when there is a issue with character encoding or decoding. So in this line, I am printing the default character encoding. Here we are using one string and it is the German character, not the English. Here what I'm converting this character into bytes. So here the encoding is happening, and this method internally uses the default encoding. Whatever we will get, and here we are converting bytes back to character. This this and here we are printing this character whatever we have got after the decoding. So this is the decoding process, this is the encoding. Both encoding and decoding uses the default character set, this whatever the value we will get here. If you check both the methods, then you will find that both methods, if you check both these API, we will see it is using the default character encoding. Let's go to the implementation of both these. So you can see this is using the default encoding. So this is the encode method. So here the decoding is happening. You can see this is also using the default encoding. So in both these operations, encoding and decoding, default encoding would be used. Now let's run this program. You can see what is the default encoding, UTF-8. We are using UTF-8. This particular line is printing the character. So this character is same as this. Means the encoding and the decoding is happening properly. Now let's change our encoding process here. So this is the encoding happening here. So let's try to convert this character, German character, using the different encoding style instead of UTF-8. Let's run this again. Now here this time you can see the default encoding is UTF-8, but here there is a question mark. Means there is some issue with the character encoding. Now let's see that. What it is doing? It is converting this character into bytes using this character encoding ASCII. Now ASCII does not support this German character. So it just give the some random byte when this conversion happens. Here the decoding happens, but this is using the default character encoding UTF-8, but UTF-8 is not able to find those bytes in its character set, that is the Unicode, and it gives the question mark that is being printed here. So you can see what type of problem occur if the encoding or the decoding is not done properly. In the decoding we are using the default encoding UTF, that is correct, but in encoding we are using that encoding scheme or standard which does not support this. That's why we are not able to decode that bytes into character. So to fix this issue we will have to use that encoding scheme which support this German character. UTF-8 supports the German character. Not only the German, it supports all of the characters available in the world. Default is UTF-8. That's why no need to mention here the UTF-8, but if you want you can mention UTF-8. Now let's run our program again, and you can see now the character is being displayed. So this type of problems occurs when the character encoding is not set properly. These are the character encoding schemes supported by Java, ASCII, ISO 8851, UTF-8, 1632. UTF-8 is widely used, so you can see Java is having good support for encoding schemes. From Java 18, UTF-8 is the default encoding scheme, but as per your requirement, you can use any of. Now let's see what is default character encoding. We will see two cases, one before Java 18 and another from Java 18. So the default encoding is the one which is set at the time of JVM startup. Now let's see the first case. Before Java 18, default encoding scheme is dependent on the local and character set or character encoding of underlying operating system on which JVM is running. For example, on Mac OS, the default character set or default encoding scheme is UTF-8. On Windows, it is Windows 1252, case 2. From Java 18 onwards, default encoding is UTF-8. So if you are on Mac OS or Linux or Windows, it doesn't matter. For all the platform, the default encoding scheme is UTF-8 from JDK 18 or Java 18. One thing I have mentioned here is JVM caches the encoding which is set at the time of startup. JVM startup. If we try to change the default encoding using programming, it might not be reflected at those places or in those APIs where default encoding or cached encoding is used. Now let me show you how to check the default encoding in Java. This is the main method. Here you can see how we can find the default encoding scheme in Java. So let's run this program. Now let's compile that class using Java C. You can see that has been compiled. Now let's run the program to see which character encoding or default character encoding scheme Java is using. So you can see this is the output. Default encoding is Windows 1252 because my system is Windows machine. This is how we can check the default character encoding scheme in Java. Now here I have mentioned few APIs examples which uses the default encoding scheme. With these APIs, if we are not setting up the encoding scheme explicitly, then these APIs will use the default encoding scheme for the encoding or decoding operation. If you don't want to use the default encoding scheme in these APIs, you can explicitly set that particular encoding scheme in the method. You can pass particular encoding scheme in the method. So let's see how it works. Let's move on to the Eclipse to get more clarity on this. Here you can see this is the string. Here this is encoding happening. It is converting this character into bytes. So the encoding is happening. So you can see we have not passed anything here. And internally this method uses the default encoding scheme. So if you don't want to use the default encoding scheme, you can pass own encoding scheme. You can pass the encoding scheme explicitly, and this method then will use this encoding scheme. So how to find the default encoding scheme set up by the JVM with this operation? You can use this. Now let's see few more examples. So here you can see this is the related to file input stream, and here we are reading this file actually. So at the time of reading, so what happens? This is the decoding process. We are reading the file, means we are getting the bytes from the memory where file is stored, and then we are converting those bytes into characters basically. So this is the decoding. In decoding also we need character encoding scheme. Here you can see this is how we can use the character encoding scheme explicitly. But if you don't use this, then it will use the default character encoding scheme internally. But explicitly if you want to mention, then you can use in this way. So this is for decode. Suppose you are creating some file using the stream. So there also you can mention the encoding scheme. So this is the encoding process, because we are saving, we are converting characters into bytes, and bytes would be saved in the memory. So this is the encoding. So here also I have mentioned the explicitly the encoding scheme. So this particular operation will use the UTF-8 to convert the character into bytes or to perform the encoding. If you don't pass the encoding scheme here, it will use the default encoding scheme. So this is how you can explicitly mention the encoding scheme with these operations. Otherwise, APIs will use the default encoding scheme which is set up by the JVM at the time of startup. Now let's see how to change the default encoding scheme. In the previous slide, we have seen that when the JVM is launched or JVM is started, it set the default encoding scheme, and the default encoding scheme value depends on the locally and operating system if your Java is before Java 18, or if you are using Java version which is from Java 18, If you want to change the default encoding scheme, you don't want to rely on the JVM setting. You don't want to rely on the JVM process. You want to give own encoding scheme at the time of startup when JVM is started. There are two ways which we can use to set the default encoding scheme. First is the passing the encoding scheme as the JVM arguments. So we need to pass this particular JVM argument when we are starting the JVM. The argument would be -dfile.encoding equal to name of the encoding scheme. Example, suppose you are executing the particular Java file. So Java and that property and value, then name of the Java file. So that we will see in demo. And second is the use the Java tool option as an environment variable. There we can set the default encoding scheme which will be picked up by the JVM when it is launched. In the example I have mentioned how you can set the environment variable. So set Java tool option space minus and the property then encoding scheme. So this we are going to see in the demo also. Now let's move on to the command prompt to see both these cases. If you are working on Java project, there would be many places where you need to keep in mind encoding scheme. So number one is the when you are writing the source code, when you are writing the Java file. So you should review your text file encoding of your IDE like Eclipse, which encoding scheme the Eclipse is using for your Java files or any text file. So first review that. And the recommendation is you should use the UTF-8 to save the Java files or any other type of file. Now let's see how we can check or update the encoding scheme in Eclipse. So let's move on to the. So for the demo also we are going to use this file only character encoding which we used in the previous slide also. So let's check what is the default character encoding scheme. I'm executing my Java file. So you can see the default encoding scheme is Windows 1252. This we have also seen in the previous slide. Because I am using the Java version 8 and for the Java version 8 JVM is dependent default operating system encoding scheme and the for Windows it is Windows 1252. Now let's see how we can change this encoding scheme. So first we will use the JVM argument method. In the JVM argument method, we need to pass this copy. Let's run our file using the JVM argument. Here we are using UTF-8. If this method works correctly, here we will get the UTF-8. So let's run this. You can see the default encoding is UTF-8. Means our JVM has recognized this parameter. So this is how you can give the instruction to JVM to use this encoding scheme. Now if we run this file without argument, it will give you the default encoding scheme, this Windows 1252. There is another way using the environment variable. So we can set the environment variable in the Java tools option. Let's set the environment variable using this command. Let's copy this. So you can see this command has been run successfully. So the environment variable has been set this with the value this. Now let's execute our file again. This Java class character encoding, char encoding. So we will have to launch our new CMD. This is our new CMD. Let's move on to the folder where our file is present and let's run our file and see what is happening. Yeah, you can see the default encoding is UTF-8. our Java tool option environment variable is working. And here also, if the JVM uses that environment variable, then it also print this message. Now with this method, you don't have to set it again whenever you are running the file. This is how you can modify the default setting, default encoding scheme. One more point to mention is this Java tools option environment variables method will also be used by the JVM when it is compiling the file. You are compiling your Java. So it is, you can see it has printed this message, picked up this and compiled the class. Means that environment variable is being used by the JVM. So this is one more advantage of this. So this is how we can change the default character encoding scheme in Java. If you are working on Java project, there would be many places where you need to keep in mind encoding scheme. So number one is the when you are writing the source code, when you are writing the Java file. So you should review your text file encoding of your IDE like Eclipse, which encoding scheme the Eclipse is using for your Java files or any text file. So first review that. And the recommendation is you should use the UTF-8 to save the Java files or any other type of file. Now let's see how we can check or update the encoding scheme in Eclipse. So let's move on to the Eclipse. To check the encoding style or scheme in Eclipse, you can follow here and go to Window, Preferences, then under General, you need to select this option Workspace. And here you can see text file encoding at the last. So you need to click on Other and select the one which you want to use. So normally we use the UTF-8 and you can apply and close. And this option would be applied across the workspace. So if you create the new file or any new project, this setting, the setting which we have done in the workspace encoding, that would be applied for that new project or for those new files, whether it's Java or any other file. So for all text files. So if you are creating new Java file, you don't have to change the encoding style. That new Java file would be using that encoding style which we have set in the workspace. So let's try to create one file and see if it is working or not. Give it name test and let's see, right click on it, properties, and here you can see this under text file encoding there is option default inherited from container. Means this file is using the encoding style which we have set in the workspace. Inherit from container means that. So we have set the UTF-8 in the workspace. That's why it is UTF-8 here. Here you also have the flexibility to change the setting for particular file. Like you want to use the different encoding style for this particular file, then you can also do from here. You need to select the other and then select the encoding style of your choice, then click on apply and close. So this particular setting would be applicable only for this file. Again, if you create new file, that new file would use the encoding style which we have set in the workspace. So this is how the encoding style you can update in Eclipse. Whenever you are starting the project, always check which encoding style you are using to save your Java file or any other file related to your project. Now the second place is the compile time. So when you are compiling your source code, Java code, then it is also very much important you should know which encoding scheme would be used when your source code is being compiled. For the web application, normally we use the build tool to compile your source code like Apache Ant or Maven. in those build tools, you can set the encoding scheme in the configuration file. So those build tools will use that encoding scheme when those are compiling the source code. You can also mention the encoding style if you are compiling particular file. There is a parameter called encoding, and you can mention when you are running the javac command, like javac minus encoding space utf-8 or any encoding style you want to use, and the name of the java file. So when your that particular java file would be compiled, it will be using that encoding scheme which you have mentioned. So if you are not mentioning any encoding style explicitly, then Java will use the default encoding scheme which we have discussed. Now let's see the demo of how you can compile particular Java file using this option, encoding option. So let's move on to the command prompt. Now let's see how we can compile particular Java file using particular encoding style, Java C, and we need to mention this parameter encode is name of the encoding style which we want to use for the compilation, then name of the Java class. The name of the Java class is this, Java. So this is how you can compile. Now our this particular class has been compiled with this encoding scheme UTF-8. So which encoding scheme this Java will use if we are not mentioning this? Like we are mentioning this only. So if we are not mentioning this parameter, the Java will use the default encoding scheme. And what is the default encoding scheme? How the Java decide the default encoding scheme? That we have seen the previous slide where we were talking about default encoding scheme. So this is how we can compile particular class using encoding scheme of our choice. So if you want to use any other encoding scheme, you can mention here. Instead of UTF-8, you can mention like UTF-16 or UTF-32, whichever encoding scheme you want to use and which is supported by the Java. In web application, we do not compile every Java class. We use the particular builder tool like Apache, Ant, or Maven. So in build tool, we will have the option to configure the encoding style for the compilation. Also, there is a recommendation at the compile time also you should use the UTF-8, but if you have explicit need of particular encoding style, then you can also use that. Now third stage or third place where the encoding scheme should be reviewed is the runtime, Java runtime. First you should check which default encoding scheme is being used by the Java when JVM is launched or started. So how to check the default encoding scheme? We have seen in the previous slide where we were talking about the default encoding scheme. And there in the previous slide also we have seen how we can change the default encoding scheme. And we should also check our APIs which are using the default encoding scheme. If we do not want to rely on the default encoding scheme provided by JVM or set by the JVM, then in the APIs or in the Java methods, we can explicitly mention the encoding scheme which we want to use for the encoding or decoding. In the previous slide, we have also seen few APIs which uses the default encoding scheme, and we have also seen how we can change that, how we can explicitly mention the default encoding scheme. So the recommendation is always try to use the UTF-8. So recommendation for all three stages is always use the UTF-8. If you have a very special kind of requirement to use particular encoding style, then you can go ahead with that. That's all for this session. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.